need to do is get a safe consumption site in Peterborough as soon as possible, because that will dramatically reduce the numbers of deaths that we see. It has worked in other cities. So I grew up in the Peterborough area. My family have been here for generations. I actually grew up in Keene, just outside of Peterborough. And when I was in high school, I went to PCVS. I was in the Integrated Arts program.
Oh, you're also a PC graduate, just like me.
Yeah. Oh, no way. Really? That's awesome.
Last graduating class.
Seriously? Oh my God. I was involved in the fight to keep PCVS, but from afar. So, I mean, I was in Toronto, and it just broke my heart. They closed it, and you can see the effect on the downtown that it's had, right? It's been, pulling all that student money out of downtown has been terrible for the city. Anyway, but awesome to fist bump, awesome to have another PCVSer in the house. Then I went to Trent University. I graduated from their English literature program, and then went into work in arts and culture in Peterborough. So I booked music at the Montreal House. I ran the Peterborough Folk Festival. I ran Peterborough Arts Week. I worked at the Canadian Canoe Museum for a while, and then found that I needed to make more money in order to pay off my student loan. There weren't a lot of jobs going here, so I ended up moving to Toronto for work. Worked at Harbourfront Centre on a short contract there, and then was at the Distillery District in Toronto for the past 5 years, working on things like the Toronto Christmas Market and running all their outdoor events and film shoots and that sort of thing. So getting back home to Peterborough has been lovely. I like Toronto, but it's not home. And Peterborough always has been home, and it's always been the place that my heart was and where my activism was centered. And I've always been politically engaged. So when I did live here before, I sat on the on the Arts, Culture, and Heritage Advisory Committee. We just call it ACAC, but that doesn't explain itself very well. And that was the advisory committee to the city of Peterborough City Council. And then I'd also been on an advisory committee to the Ontario Ministry of Arts, Culture, Tourism, and Sport on the creation of the Ontario Music Fund. So I've been sort of politically engaged in different ways. But this year, looking at climate change and looking at the way the world is going, on human rights, on social justice, and on the sort of lackluster efforts by our government and other governments to combat the climate crisis, I thought it was time to get involved in a really serious way and put myself more on the line than I have in the past. So that's why I stood up for the NDP nomination, and I was very pleased that I got it. So campaigning has been wonderful.
So are you more focused on local issues, specific here to Peterborough and the Kawarthas, or is it more kind of federal, worldwide issues? Because you did mention climate change, and that's a wide-reaching issue, but like, which kind of end of the spectrum do you more lean towards?
I would say probably more local issues, and I consider climate change, though it is a national and international issue, to actually be very much a local issue. I mean, we've seen the flooding that's happened here in the region. We've seen this cold, wet spring that we had that didn't allow farmers to get their stuff in the ground early in the season, and delayed the growing season pretty significantly. We're seeing the effects here. And more we're going to be dealing with the catastrophic effects of climate change in this region. And people in the rural areas are often going to be hit first and hit hardest because the resources just aren't there to support them, or to put in place the things that mitigate the effects of climate change. So we need to step up our support for the rural areas, especially for farmers as they face, because they are very much on the front line of the climate crisis, and they're seeing it in their growing cycles shortening or changing, or just seasons getting weirder and stranger and more destructive to crops, and not great for animal life either.
So what is the NDP's climate plan then, if elected?
Yeah, well, we actually have a really terrific and comprehensive plan. It's very carefully thought through, very strategic. So we know we need to divest from oil and gas. And probably everyone in this community either has a friend or family member who's gone out west to work in the oil fields. And we want to make sure that those people can come back home when they leave that industry and find good work at home, because most people don't want to, travel out to Alberta. They want to work in their own communities. So we know we need to divest, but we don't want to leave the people in those jobs stranded with no income and no job prospects. So we're talking about a transition to a green economy that would include the creation of new jobs in the new green economy. So that's in things like home retrofitting, in manufacturing, installation of solar panels, of electric car charging stations, all that kind of stuff. So we just want to make sure that we're taking care of workers, and workers are center in our program to move forward and divest. We would remove the $3.3 billion a year subsidy for oil and gas industries, and we would instead put that money into renewables, research and development, and getting those renewables to market through offering incentives for buying zero emissions cars or low emission cars as people are replacing their vehicles. We'd also move to replace gas and diesel powered buses in our public transit with electric or other low emission vehicles. And we want to see the entire bus fleet across Canada transferred over to low emission vehicles, whatever way that makes most sense for both the environment and the economy. And there's some good jobs in that too. And then we want to make sure that in cities, public transit is free. To encourage people to get out of their cars and to take public transit where possible. We also want to improve public transit in rural areas. So, in Lakefield, they have the workers' bus that comes into town, and that's been really successful, and that's been a long-running project. But we'd like to see that in some other rural areas as well, so that rural communities are more connected to cities and don't have to rely so much on cars. But we also need, obviously, to find ways to make sure that people who just need to have a personal vehicle can still have one, but it's a low emission vehicle. So we're looking at solutions for that, including built in Canada low emission vehicles. And we'd also, there's so many things we would do. We would ban single use plastics, and we'd also make companies and corporations responsible for the waste that they put out into the world. So whether that's air pollution or whether that's actual garbage or recycling, we know that if we make companies responsible for what they create, that they will then reduce the amount that they create on their own.
Is that in the form of a carbon tax, or?
We would leave the carbon tax in place, but there would be separate legislation that says if you ship a product, you're responsible for the packaging. Because companies for a long time have downloaded those costs onto the municipalities, and municipalities shouldn't have to pay to recycle something that a company should be reducing in the first place. When I was a kid, pop was shipped in glass bottles, which is not that long ago. This is the 80s. Pop was shipped in glass bottles. You took the glass bottle back to the store. When you were done with it, you got a 10-cent return on your deposit, and then the bottles would be shipped back. That is a very straightforward system, and companies could reduce enormously the amount of waste they produce if they were shipping in glass. It is a lot heavier, so the carbon footprint is different. But you just look at things like that where they're reusing a product instead of recycling or whatever. And we really need to reduce the amount of new garbage we're creating, totally aside from everything else. The reduction is reduces the first of the 3 R's. And so we need to make sure corporations are taking that very seriously and that they suffer financial penalties if they don't.
So I guess the big question that a lot of people who are hesitant when it comes to investing in these climate change initiatives is, how do we end up affording these things, especially when you talk about, updating transit fleets and improving rural infrastructure when it comes to transit and making sure that those vehicles are environmentally friendly as well, but then also divesting in Canada's oil interests, because, if you look out in Alberta, a significant portion of their economy is based on oil. So how do we go about making sure that that part of the country is still economically sustainable, but then also we're able to afford these green initiatives?
Well, we have several different ways of addressing that. We know in Alberta, the majority of people who have great jobs are working in oil and gas. But Alberta is also perfectly placed to be a leader in green energy. They could do solar and wind probably as well or better than any other province in Canada. They have a lot of very intelligent people. They have a lot of people who are trained for specific work and could easily be retrained if that training was offered. So this is part of our focus on a just transition, that we don't want to leave people high and dry. And sorry, we divested from fossil fuels, so sorry, bud, you're out of a job. We don't want us to have that situation. We want to take care of those people. And we think that if you're on the front lines of the oil and gas industry, you should be in the first in line for retraining. So, and for good new jobs. So we want to retrain those workers, and we'll fund that retraining. And we want to make sure that they have good jobs in the renewables sector, the renewable energy sector. And some of the ways we do that is we're going to add a 1% tax on people who have more than $20 million a year, which is nobody I know, but maybe nobody you know. And it's about 6,000 or 7,000 families across Canada. Over 10 years, that tax would raise $70 billion. So that's going to really help. We also would close corporate tax loopholes. That's about $25 billion a year in lost tax revenue for the government that the current government seems not very dedicated to reclaiming. But if corporations were paying their fair share, that's an enormous amount of money that could be reinvested into our health and prosperity. But also, we know that if you look down the line, the cost of not dealing with the climate crisis is going to be many, many, many times more, exponentially larger than the cost of working to prevent the climate crisis. So, in a financial toll, but also in a human toll. If we suffer from droughts and wildfires and floods, we're going to find out of our wild that we're not able to have a growing season at all. And then we're not able to feed Canadians. And then we're going to get into other drastic situations. We need to dial back on global warming as quickly as possible. People sounding the alarm bells, some people are saying, oh, it's a hysteria. But in truth, it's not. We should be afraid. But we should also be optimistic that we can move forward and we can combat this. And it is going to cost money, and it is going to mean inconveniences. And I know lots of people who don't like the don't like the carbon tax. And we would keep that in place, partially because, it's a little pain now, but if we don't take these steps, it will be a lot of pain in the future.
Okay. I do have to move on from climate change, but I'm glad we could spend so much time on it, because there are some other important issues, especially ones that our community are facing. And one of those important ones, and I think that was really highlighted this summer especially, was the housing market. And Peterborough's housing market has been very tough the past few years. Our rental vacancy rate is somewhere around 1.5%. Our housing prices have continued to go up as supply goes down. And we're really in a tough spot here. And I think a lot of people have been asking our federal government to step in and participate. And what would that look like in the form of an NDP government?
So we're committed to building 500,000 new affordable homes across Canada, including in this community. And that's something that will take some time. But the federal government got out of building affordable housing in the 80s, and we haven't really seen any renewed investment in that by the federal government in that time. So 35 years, no new affordable housing being built, and the need doesn't decrease. So we know we need to get the federal government back in the business of building affordable. It doesn't make sense for a for-profit corporation to build affordable homes, given the expense and all of the work that goes into one of those. But the government can put incentives in place, can put the hash into the market to make those happen, and we need the government to be doing that, and they should have been doing it all along. So the 500,000, we know that's not going to completely address the housing crisis, but that's something that will ease the market over time. And it's not something that's going to happen tomorrow, but over the next decade, we'll put that back into the market, put new housing on the market that's affordable for people at the lower rung. So there's some movement there. We also, in the short term, want to put in place a up to $5,000 a year incentive, or not incentive, a $5,000 a year fund per person for about 500,000 Canadians in order to assist them in paying for their rents. It's a short-term solution. It's a stopgap, but we need a stopgap because we have that gap, and that need is urgent. Coming from the arts and culture sector, I'm more aware than many people of how much housing impacts not just individuals, but our community and our economy. People in the arts are always living on the fringes and often living in poverty or near poverty. And so we see that come up again and again as an arts and culture issue, but it's a community-wide issue as well. And right now we're seeing, seniors who want to downsize from their family home to something more manageable that has less maintenance, and there's nowhere for them to go. So we do need to be building stock at every possible level, but we need to also be building smaller stock. A lot of millennials want a smaller house. You hear a lot about the tiny homes movement, and a lot of people my age too, I'm sort of the tail end of Gen X. We don't want to have 3 bathrooms because that's just 3 bathrooms to clean. So we want something small and manageable. Elders often want something small and manageable. We're just getting to a point where people are, sort of looking at the huge house and going, I don't really want that much property. So we need to be investing more in smaller homes so that people can downsize.
So what is the model in which that is sustainable? So is that housing that is funded by and run by the federal government? Is that money that goes to municipalities so that they can run their own affordable housing projects? Mm-hmm. Or is that giving money to private landlords so that they can build that stock of housing and then you just fund them to keep it going? So what does that take the shape of?
I think it'll look different in different communities, but always working in partnership as much as possible with the different levels of government, so municipal and provincial where possible. Sometimes that's not possible for whatever reason. You get there's an adversarial relationship with certain levels of government, with certain councils, with certain provincial legislatures. And you've got to work with the people who will work with you. Mm-hmm. So it doesn't just mean building new buildings, but perhaps funding to create co-ops, funding for alternative housing, changing municipal bylaws so that smaller houses can be built, so that co-housing makes more sense, so that we can look at different solutions and strategies for dealing with affordability and the housing stock. So I think all of those solutions are possibilities. We don't have one set plan because it's a complex problem, and one set plan is not there's no one size fits all across Canada. Different communities have different needs, so we'll work with the different communities to see what makes the best sense for them.
Mm-hmm. And when it comes to housing, I talk to a lot of advocates and people who are interested in the topic over the course of the summer, especially as, with Tent City and everything like that, our community really has been hit hard by the housing and homelessness conversation.
Yeah.
And, one of the things that has been repeatedly hit home in those conversations is that this can't be something that just the municipal government is dealing with.
No.
It has to be all levels of government. Mm-hmm. So how would an NDP, especially on this portfolio, just on this portfolio, and we can talk about other ones as well, but when it comes to housing, how would a NDP federal government work with a provincial progressive conservative government to make sure and try to get that funding here locally, especially as our provincial government is currently looking at cutting the deficit and might not be interested in putting money into housing.
I think the current provincial government in Ontario is a challenge, but I think the best you can do is make a business case to them, and if they're willing to work with you, they'll see the business case and understand it. This is not a situation where the private market where private corporations are going to provide a solution. We're just going to see an increase in housing insecurity and homelessness. And when you look at the numbers, even if you were giving someone free housing for a year, let's say, someone who is securely housed, securely, safely, and healthfully housed, would cost the government a lot less money than someone who is living homelessness and living on the street. I think the estimate that I've heard is every person, when you average out the cost per person of homelessness, it's about $200,000 per person. Well, $200,000 would house several people. Mm-hmm. So we spend a lot of money, and that's in all kinds of different services. It's in social services and healthcare, lots of different places. And in sort of the work that goes into supporting and finding solutions for people who are homeless costs quite a bit more than just straight up housing people. So building affordable housing it's a pretty small investment with a huge return, and that's because we're not talking about free housing, we're talking about affordable. And a lot of people who are, for example, a lot of people living in Tent City this summer and now are working. They are on benefits. They're doing casual work where they can. They go down to, you know, one of the like labor ready kind of places. They get day work where they can. But, you know, they're undermined by the fact that they're not sleeping well because they're living in a tent. You know, if they're in shelters, sometimes you wake up in the morning, their shoes have been stolen. Well, you can't go to a job site without proper work boots. So, you know, these kinds of obstacles that are put in place for someone who is dealing with homelessness or is dealing with housing insecurity, you know, they're not taken into account a lot of the time when people talk about homelessness. So these are not, you know, people who are just lazing about. These are actual working people who still can't afford a place to live, and they want to work and they want to pay rent. So we're talking about building housing that they can afford to then pay the rent in. Because if your benefits are only $700 a month, you can't pay most of the rents in Peterborough, even for you know, a rooming house or something like that. That's quite a lot of money. And when you factor in that you also need food, clothing, other basic necessities, it gets pretty unaffordable pretty quickly. So you can see why people are ending up living in tents on a church lawn in the city right now. I mean, even myself, you know, this is, I moved back to Peterborough this winter, but we're in the middle of a housing crisis, so I moved back in with my mom. And when I left Peterborough, the only place I could afford to live was with my mom. And I pay rent to her. But, you know, this is a situation the city's been in not for a year or 5 years, but for 20 years. And that's been true for a long time here, that the rents have been out of step with what you can make in this city. So we need to also address income and income stability, because right now a lot of people, especially my age and I'm sure your age, are in precarious work, they're in contract jobs, they don't have benefits, so there's not a lot of security there. So even if they get into an apartment, the chances that they'll be able to stay there for more than a year are slim, because they might lose their work, another contract might not come along when the first one ends, and you know, they could have situations where they have, you know, they need a tooth extraction because they have a dental infection, and that could knock out their payment for rent for that month and put them behind in a way that they can't recover from. So we need to ensure that people have a more stable footing, and that's one of the reasons we want to introduce pharmacare and head-to-toe health care as well, because not only would that help all Canadians, but it would really help people at that bottom end of the income ladder, and it would mean that they had a lot more stability, because a sudden illness or a sudden infection wouldn't necessarily wipe out that month's rent from their bank account.
Okay, so we're going to take a short break right now, and then we'll
good.
come back and we'll talk about some other important issues.
Awesome.
All right, perfect. So we are back, and let's talk about a couple of other issues. I got two more here on my list here. So let's talk about the opioid crisis, because that's something that our numbers here in Peterborough are shocking.
Yeah.
And people are dying at an alarming rate. And something needs to be done, because we're not the only community that's dealing with this.
Absolutely.
So what is the NDP's plan to deal with the opioid crisis? Because we are definitely seeing the effects of it here in Peterborough.
Yeah, in the short term, I think personally we need a safe injection site, and we need it as soon as possible. I know a lot of people object. They believe that it encourages the use of drugs. They believe that we should only have a safe consumption site if we pair it with treatment facility. But the fact of the matter is you can't treat people who have died. You can't do anything. Death is the final. It's the end to all possibility. So we need to make sure that we are keeping people alive in the first place, and then work towards a solution on several fronts. So what we need to do is get a safe consumption site in Peterborough as soon as possible, because that will dramatically reduce the numbers of deaths that we see. It has worked in other cities. I lived in Toronto when they put the safe injection site in Moss Park. I saw a decided downturn in the number of people I saw just pass out on the street on my way to and from work every day. And I walked through Moss Park on my way to work every day. So that was a visible difference. And then I know, because of the statistics that they've provided, that it's a reduction in deaths. Now, it's not an end to them. And whether or not we'll ever be able to stop all overdose deaths is something we'll work towards, but I'm not sure we ever will. But we really do have to look at the causes of addiction, because it's not a personal choice. No one decides they want to become an addict. And a lot of the time people become addicts or they end up dealing with addiction because they've either suffered personal trauma that has left them psychologically in a place where where dealing with the pain of that trauma means ingesting some kind of substance that helps them deal with that pain, or they're dealing with physical pain. I talked to a friend who works with an organization that specifically focuses on homeless and housing insecure people, and a lot of those people are also dealing with addiction. He told me that a lot of the people that he was working with became addicts over time because they were trying to numb dental pain. And so in Canada, every 4 minutes we have someone go into the ER with dental pain. And that's something that's easily preventable. If we put in place a national dental care program, which is something the NDP have proposed. So we want to see what we can do to get ahead of the addictions before they form. So we want to make sure that we have head-to-toe medical coverage that allows people to get treatment for things like dental pain, mental health issues, anything around that. That will help us get ahead and get to people before they are beginning to deal with addiction. But once we do have people who are addicted, we also need to make sure that we're fully funding treatment. And we do need a treatment center here in Peterborough. But another problem is Peterborough's had an addiction crisis for more than 30 years. If you talk to anyone in the social services, any of the frontline first responders, and many people in communities like my own, we've seen the toll that addiction has taken on Peterborough's community for a very long time. And the reason it's becoming deadly now and increasingly deadly, and this year in particular, is that fentanyl has made its way into the supply. And unscrupulous dealers are adding it to the supply to boost the effects. And so keep people coming back. And unfortunately, fentanyl is a very difficult drug to manage outside of a lab situation. And when they add it, sometimes they add it without the proper oversight, and people are dying because it can be a very deadly drug if not used appropriately. So what we need to do is look at that supply and look at how we can keep fentanyl out of the drug supply. And there are several different approaches, but one of them is to see what we can do about the amount of drugs coming into Canada from outside. And those are often, the fentanyl is often in them before they get here. So we need to find a way to stop that. And there are different approaches, and some people, really want to talk about controlling the supply. And I'm not sure what the best approach is on that.
So you'd mentioned consumption site and treatment center. What does the funding model for that look like locally? Is that something that's 100% funded by the federal government, or is that something that the cost is shared amongst multiple levels of government? What does that look like?
Technically, healthcare in Canada is funded primarily by the provinces, or is it primarily in the control of the provinces, which is, I think, why we don't have a safe injection site here in Peterborough now, because the province needs to approve it. And that's why we don't have one. I say to them, it's a question of saving lives or not saving lives. And they've chosen, in my opinion, not to save lives. They have chosen to allow these deaths. And so I lay them at the feet of the province, because we should have had a safe consumption site here long ago.
Now, I do want to add, though,
Yeah.
Dave Smith has made a pledge to bring a consumption site here to Peterborough. What are your thoughts on that?
He's made a pledge to bring a consumption and treatment facility to Peterborough. And though I agree we do need treatment desperately here, a treatment facility will take a long time to put in place. Too long. We will absolutely lose more people in our community to addiction, to opioid overdose, between now and whenever a treatment facility is built, or staffed, or has all the resources in place to open its doors and actively be treating people in this community. To me, that's a delaying tactic. If Dave Smith was pushing for a safe consumption site, he would 100% have my support and thanks. But to me, waiting on and insisting on a safe consumption and treatment site is a delaying tactic. And it is because I don't think, wants a safe consumption site in Peterborough. And Maybe there are forces in the community who also do not want one here, but if the longer we delay in bringing a safe consumption site to Peterborough, the more deaths there will be.
So then how do you get the provinces to do that then? Do you kind of federally mandate that the provinces have to have some kind of treatment/consumption site plan? And then let the provinces come up with their own model for how that looks like? How do you, from a federal level, make that happen?
It's very hard to say. And until I'm in the federal government, it's very difficult for me to say how it would work. I think with some provinces, it would be fairly straightforward. I think with Ontario right now, that's going to be a very difficult question. But in the meantime, people are going to die. And I right now, I lay that at the feet of our provincial government and our MPP. Leave Miriam out of that. I leave that at the feet of our provincial government here and our MPP, who have chosen to insist on a longer term process when they could literally open one in a matter of probably weeks or a month, rather than this delayed process of gathering signatures in support and then taking them to the province and then going through more back and forth. For me, we need to hold their feet to the fire and say, these deaths we lay at your door. These are our community members. These are our friends, our family. These are the people you pass on your way to work in the morning, and the people who you buy your groceries from, and the people who, potentially are working next to you in your office. This is not, some other. Addiction affects every strata of society, and we have not dealt well with the addiction crisis, and frankly, I am quite angry about the way that our community has been neglected and treated in this respect.
Okay.
Because we are number one in the province for addiction deaths,
Mm-hmm.
and that's a number one spot we don't want to be in.
Is there a timeline that you think for when those sites might be available in Peterborough if after the election, if the NDP were elected?
I mean, I would do all that I can, and I am, like I said, quite angry, quite frustrated with the delay and the insistence on going through a process that makes no sense in the face of an emergency, in the face of a catastrophe. If there was any other reason that 26 people had died in Peterborough, we would be taking drastic action, and there would be no delay. I think even in July we had something like 19 deaths. If we had taken action then then there would have been, 8 more people alive in the city, and 8 more lives. I mean, that's a lot. I can't promise exactly what I would do, but I can promise that I'm angry as hell and that I want to see action as soon as possible. I'd prefer it if it happened before the election. I'd prefer it if I didn't have to go and fight with our provincial government to get a safe consumption site here. But this is drastic and it's an emergency, and I don't think they're taking it seriously enough. And I think it's because, they don't prioritize the lives of people suffering with addictions.
Okay. Let's move on to the last topic we have for the day, and that is just talking about how, I think in the last couple of years, and I think you can kind of pinpoint it about 4 or 5 years ago now, politics has started to get messy and personal, and there's a lot of contributing factors to that. Especially if you look south of our border, there's a lot of politics there has gotten really personal,
Mm-hmm.
and some of that has kind of spilled over into Canada as well. What are your thoughts on the current kind of state of politics, and do you have any plans to kind of rise above that messiness?
It's difficult. All of us now, we live our lives in ways that are recorded, in ways that have never been recorded before. We all carry phones in our pocket that are instant publishing tools, that are cameras, that are video cameras, that are recording devices. We capture so many moments of our lives that otherwise would have gone unrecorded. So we are more aware of the human failings of individuals than we ever have been before. And it's, and also the way things are disseminated is much faster than in the past. So we get a more rounded glimpse of who people are. And in some ways, that means that if you've worn blackface in the past, that's going to come up. And there are lots of things in lots of people's past that they might be embarrassed by, or that were mistakes, or that they have learned are not something you should do. And I think the best you can do in those situations is apologize and move on. But I think also we're going to have to come to a reckoning at some point in the near future. More and more millennials are getting into politics. And we're going to see the next generation also who have, and those are people who've lived their entire lives with the presence of the internet, and who's potentially, whose parents have had parent blogs about them potty training. So, like, what are we going to do when our prime minister is someone whose mom had a blog and talked intimately about toilet training the prime minister, as a toddler. So, I mean, that's going to be an interesting dynamic, and we're going to have to become more accepting of human failure, and of the range of human emotions and experiences. And that doesn't mean necessarily excusing or accepting racist behavior or sexist behavior. That does mean as a society, we're going to have to become better about the way we treat each other. And I think that's not a bad thing.
Looking online at social media, it's there you see crowds of people that tend to rally around movements or individuals or groups, and they get fired up and they just go.
Yeah.
So, do you see, if you are one of those individuals that, you have this group around you that is supportive of you and they'll do anything to make sure that you win, how do you make sure, kind of as a leader, that kind of things around you remain civil?
I think you have to be very overt about your intentions. If you look at someone like Jagmeet Singh, he leads with love and with courage, and he does that in all his interactions with people. And that's not a strategy that's going to work for everybody. But I think if, for example, people who are mega fans of Jagmeet, his real stands, were going to come out there and start hammering away at another politician who is his opposition, I think if things started to get nasty or or overly violent, he would step in and he would say, please be respectful. Please work within this democratic process. Please understand that we're all humans. I mean, my colleague candidates are all good people, I think. From my interactions with them, I've known Miriam a long time. I've only recently met Mike and Andrew, but they're good people and they want to see the best for this community and the best for the world. I disagree very strongly with their parties, but I don't always disagree strongly with the other candidates. I mean, sometimes they'll say, oh, well, I'm going to try to be a progressive voice within my party. I'm very lucky in that I don't have to try and change my party at all. My party already espouses the progressive values that most Canadians share. But, I look at my opponents and I don't think that's an evil guy, or that's an evil woman. I just think that's a person who has different ideas than me. And I think as a group, when we meet, when we're on stage at events, we're quite friendly with each other. Sometimes there's a little pot shot here and there. But myself, I want to keep this as friendly as possible. I want to focus on the parties and focus on the ideas and not so much on the individuals, because we're all human and we're all fallible. And there's lots of things that I have learned over my 42 years on this earth that I didn't know to start. And there are lots of ways in which my thinking has evolved and changed, even in the last 10 years. As we've seen the rise of different movements online, and I have been able to access activists of all stripes and hear different ideas, whether it's, listening to the ideas and, whether you like them or accept them or not, but listening to the ideas of people who have very different experiences from you. And I've been able to learn so much and understand much better my place in the world and in this country and in this political system and in my community than I was able to understand before. My hope is that we won't get nasty. I hope the leaders don't get nasty, because I also know that in an election, when things start getting personal and nasty, that's when voters tune out. And that doesn't serve any cause that I'd stand for. I want as many people voting as possible. We have a high voter turnout in Peterborough. but we could have a higher one. But if we start getting mean to each other, people will be like, oh, they're all jerks. I don't want to vote for any of these people. They're nasty and they're mean and they're not leading us in a progressive direction. And I think that that our job is not to get down in the mud and wrestle with each other, and not to say, you know, you said this stupid thing, you know, and constantly be pulling up their human foibles. If it's a character issue, it's a character issue. That's totally different. But if, you know, they made mistakes in their past, you know, I'm not going to get into it. I want to talk about their ideas, their party's ideas, and what they stand for, and what they'll do in the future, rather than focus entirely on what they've done in the past.
Okay. Before we wrap up, I'll just leave it with you. Is there anything else that you would like to add?
I think, you know, this experience, people have told me, was going to be terrible and difficult and stressful. And though it is a lot of work, and it's a lot of running around the countryside trying to get to all the different events and appointments and all candidates' meetings, it has actually been lovely. The people in this community are amazing. When you knock on their door, they don't slam the door in your face, even if they don't believe in anything that you're saying. They hear you out, or they're very polite, they take your literature, and they say, thank you so much for running. And that has been an incredible experience. So regardless of the outcome of this election, I would 100% run again, and I would encourage anyone out there who's thought about getting involved in the political process to not be afraid of it. It's worth the plunge. It's worth stepping forward. It's worth running as a candidate, because it is an amazing experience. And, you know, though there are downsides and it can be quite stressful, and sometimes people do get personal, on the whole, most people here are really good, and they actually just want what's best for Peterborough. So that's the community that I believe in, and that's the community that I'm seeing every time I knock on someone's door, every time I go to an event, and it's been very heartening and uplifting. So I just think people need to know that it's actually a lot more fun than maybe it's been made out to look, and it is a lot of work, but I don't know anybody who's afraid of hard work.
All right. Thank you so much for being on the show. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I appreciate it too.